having the wrong strategy would put even more soldiers at risk. So I think it's important to get the strategy right, and then we can make the resources decisions.
That was, of course, Secretary of Defense Robert Gates speaking this week with George Stephanopoulos. The Secretary was alluding to what has become something of a holding pattern on the topic of Afghanistan. A little bit of a chicken and egg game, right, Karen?
Absolutely.
With resources, strategy, the president waiting, he says, to get all the information before he makes a big decision.
And there are going to be some big conversations coming up. The president has some very high-level, high-stakes meetings. Top Line starts right now.
Welcome to Top Line. I'm Rachel Martin.
And I'm Karen Travers.
Each day we bring you the latest in all your political news, political happenings, even a little bit of analysis. With that, Karen, what's your first top line?
Let's go right into the top lines. Going for the gold. President Obama announced today that he is heading to Copenhagen at the end of the week, where he's going to make that final pitch to the International Olympic Committee. They really want Chicago to get that 2016 games. But President Obama seems to be putting a little bit of his own capital on the line. They might get this, but if they don't, he's really the public face of this push, I think, Rachel.
And the hometown guy. I mean, kind of, if you can't bring it home, who can? So,
Oprah.
Yeah, Oprah.
She's going to,
Is that confirmed?
She is going as well.
Oprah Winfrey.
How can you turn down President Obama and Oprah Winfrey?
It's a power team,
Absolutely.
I'll tell you. Copenhagen, watch out. Okay, my top line, first up, Iran fires back. Today was the second day of a two-day military exercise by Iran. During this exercise, they fired short, medium, and long-term missiles. Some of these missiles have the capability to hit Israel, even some U.S. bases in the Persian Gulf. And of course, Karen, this all comes in the wake of a serious smackdown of Iran by the U.S. and Western allies last week over the revelation that Iran has been building this secret nuclear facility in the mountains in the holy city of Qom. And this is obviously something that the Obama administration is taking very seriously, and it comes at a very precarious time, right?
Very interesting time going to this very important meeting this week, the first time that the United States is going to sit down and actually have some sort of negotiations with Iran. Of course, they just continue to flout the international community on this, so that sets up a very big meeting on Friday.
And we're going to talk more about Iran in just a minute.
Absolutely. Our third top line is Patterson pushes back. New York Governor David Patterson was on the morning shows, Meet the Press, yesterday morning, and he said that he's blind, but he is not oblivious to the push from top Democrats in Washington and New York who are trying to get him out of this race to run for re-election next year in New York. He's not going anywhere. He is standing firm. The White House has gone out on a limb. They've made their intentions very clear. They're setting up, I think, what's going to be a really interesting next couple months because it doesn't look like he's going anywhere.
Did he really say I'm blind but not oblivious?
He did.
Good for him. Strong statement. Okay, last top line today, losing a legend. Conservative columnist and famed wordsmith William Safire passed away yesterday. He was 79 years old. And of course, Safire made his name actually in the Nixon White House, writing some sometimes acerbic comments that have lived on far beyond their years. Most famously, he wrote a line for the White House in which he criticized Vietnam critics, the critics of the Vietnam War in the press, calling them, quote, nattering nabobs of negativism, rather. And I have to admit to you, Karen, I had no idea what a nabob was, and I had to look it up myself. But Safire also, obviously, he spent more than 3 decades at the New York Times as a conservative columnist, and he also wrote the column called On Language, which I just loved. I just
keeping journalists and the American public in check.
In check, making sure we know what we're talking about. So those are our top lines for today, and we're going to segue back into what we started off talking about earlier. Foreign policy. This has been a huge week in foreign policy for the White House. The president wrapping up a big week at the UN General Assembly, also talking at the G20 last week, and Iran seemed to dominate those conversations, along with something that maybe made it into the subtext, if not in the forefront, the war in Afghanistan. And we're very lucky right now to welcome onto Top Line Richard Fontaine. He's with the Center for a New American Security. He's a senior fellow there. Thanks for being here, Richard.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
You also have some experience as a foreign policy advisor for a certain senator from Arizona.
That's right, Senator John McCain.
Senator John McCain.
Senate and on the presidential campaign.
He knows a little something about wars and strategies.
That's right.
So talk to me a little bit about what you suspect to be a timeline for a decision. This is, of course, the $69 gazillion question. Right. We've got the report from Stanley McChrystal, the head guy in Afghanistan, in which he's expected to ask for thousands of more troops. The president says, wait a second, I'm not going to make any big decisions about this. We need to deliberate. We need to come up with a strategy before we decide about troop resources. But all the while, this war keeps happening. And this is a dangerous holding pattern of sorts, no?
Well, as you said, the administration has divided this into two separate decisions. Some may have argued before that it was sort of one decision. You have a strategy and you figure out the resources you need to carry out the strategy. But the president has decided that he'll first make a decision on whether to recommit to the strategy that he announced in March, which was a counterinsurgency strategy in Afghanistan that focuses on protecting the Afghan population, which is very different from the way we've been doing the war there, which has focused on killing bad guys, killing the Taliban, calling in airstrikes, trying to hold small amounts of territory around bases and that sort of thing. So the administration officials have talked about 2 weeks or so, the next 2 weeks, that they'll have a series of meetings where they will decide whether to recommit to the strategy the president announced in March, a counterinsurgency strategy, or go with a different strategy. There's been reports that, for example, the vice president has been advocating a narrower strategy that would focus again on using predator drones and special forces to go after terrorists and kill them or capture them without trying to protect the population. Following that decision on the strategy, Secretary Gates has said then they will consider the resource question. Resource essentially means troops. How many troops is it going to be required? How many more Americans, if any more Americans, is it going to take in order to carry out the strategy they choose?
But Richard, do you think that's the best way to do it, to separate it out? How can you separate out the resources when you're considering the strategy? Doesn't that question have to be part of the strategy question going forward?
I think it does. They can sort of conceptually separate it to a degree, but to talk about strategy without having those discussions being informed in any way by the amount of troops you have, for example, at your disposal, isn't always the best way to proceed. It seems to me that it makes a lot more sense to have, at least on the table, the levels of resources that you'll be able to bring to bear in a number of these various scenarios, and then talk about what the best strategy is to achieve success in Afghanistan. Now, if they do this, 2 weeks on the strategy and then immediately sort of come in to talk about the resources, maybe they can come to an outcome that approximates that. But I think both of the discussions are going to have to be informed by the other one.
I want to get your take on something that's become kind of a rallying cry on the left. People actually asking the question that maybe it's hard to believe we're asking now in 2009, but a lot of people saying, is the Taliban really a threat? Did we not go to Afghanistan to fight al-Qaeda after 9/11? Many people saying, military analysts saying, show me where the Taliban is a direct threat that would warrant such a huge strategy as has been outlined to rebuild civil society in Afghanistan, create some kind of indigenous economy, stuff that's never happened there before that would be a massive undertaking over years and years and years.
Well, the main threat that the Taliban poses is in its alliance with al-Qaeda. We saw that before the Taliban fell in 2001, and as General McChrystal's assessment demonstrates, the various elements of the insurgency currently in Afghanistan now have varying levels of connections with al-Qaeda, mostly al-Qaeda present in Pakistan. And so it's a very reasonable conclusion to draw that should the Taliban come back into power in Afghanistan, they would bring back the al-Qaeda in a way that approximates what was there before 2001, or at least in a way that is a direct threat to our national interests, because as we know, al-Qaeda is in the business of planning attacks against the United States and our allies around the world. So it's the Taliban's connection with al-Qaeda that is the foremost threat. But in addition to that, when it comes to getting a leg up on the terrorists who threaten the United States, much of this is about recruiting and about the resources the terrorists can bring to bear in terms of their attacks that they like to plan on the United States. And it's hard to think of a better sort of recruiting tool that al-Qaeda and its allied networks could have than it was able to defeat a superpower, the United States, in Afghanistan.
It's obviously questions we're going to be asking for a long time. Richard Fontaine, Center for a New American Strategy, thanks for coming in.
Thank you very much.
We'll be right back.